Speaking for the motion before this House, we have, as first speaker for the affirmative is Chris Bonnor AM, a retired secondary school principal and author. He's a contributing author of the Centre for Policy Development's publication More Than Luck, Ideas Australia Needs Now, as well as being a regular writer and commentator on issues involving education. Other information you might like to know about our speakers is included in the order paper. He's joined by Beatrice Duong, a Year 11 student from John Monash Science School in Clayton. Beatrice has debated since Year 8 and has since gone on to captain her debating team, has competed in multiple tournaments and has been involved in the 2010-2011 Victorian State School squad and team. And finally, they are joined by Shane Maloney, one of Australia's most popular novelists. He's been published in the UK, Germany, France, Britain, Japan, Finland and the US, and no doubt other places as well. His award-winning and much-loved Murray Whelan series is characterised by a strong sense of humour and an acute sense of Melbourne's political and cultural nuances, some of which I think we might find out about tonight. Would you please welcome the speakers for the affirmative? Speaking before this House against the motion, leading the negative team is Dr Kevin Donnelly, one of Australia's leading education commentators. Kevin has written over 400 articles in the daily media and professional journals. He's taught English for 18 years in Victorian government and non-government secondary schools. He's joined by another student debater, Andrew Elder, a Year 12 student at Scotch College. Andrew has debated throughout his school career, culminating in 2010 when he helped lead his school team to win the Victorian B-grade championships. He was selected in the Victorian Schools debating team and, as he notes, as the youngest of 5 children, passionately arguing his point comes quite naturally. And last but not least is Amanda Vanstone, who many of you will remember as a former senior Australian politician in the Senate. After leaving politics, Amanda was Australia's ambassador to Italy from June 2007 to May 2010. Before that, held several ministerial portfolios in the Howard government, including Minister for Immigration, Minister for Employment, Education, Training and Youth Affairs, I think Minister for Justice, and Minister for Family and Community Services and Indigenous Affairs. Would you please welcome the speakers for the negative? Ladies and gentlemen, the proposition before this House is that public funding of private education is unconscionable. I invite Chris Bonnor to address this House with his arguments for the affirmative.
Thanks very much, Simon. Folks, it had to happen to me on my very last day as a public school principal. A family came in to enrol their son. And he was struggling at his local private school. He probably kicked over the traces a bit. And eventually the parents were called in to see the headmaster and were told with regret that it was time to let him go. So they knocked on the doors of 4 other schools, all with Saint or Grammar or Christian in their names, and they were all full or unable to cater for his special needs. This family had been enticed by the language of choice, and they suddenly discovered the flip side of choice. And of course we took their son. Public schools alone have that obligation to all students. We cannot discriminate. Why does it matter? It matters because discrimination in enrolments that makes the public funding of education delivered by private schools unconscionable. Why did it happen in our country? Because when church schools began to seek public funding decades ago, other countries said, yes, we will fund your schools, but you must serve all students and you must not charge fees. They were concerned that having fee-charging schools next to inclusive public schools, you would have one lot enrolling higher income families and the inclusive schools would end up serving the poor. And that's the point we are rapidly reaching. We've long known now that our schools are forming hierarchical layers, not created by how good or bad they are, but created by who walks in through the front gate each day. For secondary schools, we have high fee schools at the top, then Anglican schools, then Catholic schools, the ones set up to serve the poor, the Catholic poor, then Christian schools, and finally government schools in that order. In some communities it resembles a social and academic apartheid. There is a diminishing circle of people who would argue otherwise, but just check the ICSIA values on the My School website for schools in your local suburbs. Try it yourselves, because this arrangement is now harder to hide. It's harder to justify. It defies accepted practice overseas, it worsens equity problems, and it probably explains our ever-lengthening underachieving tail. Now, our opposition tonight will probably argue that we've always had social differences between schools, and indeed we have. But for a century, governments have strived to lessen the gap, to reduce the differences. Not anymore. Government funding stands alongside parent funding to create, not reduce, disparities between schools. Governments are now active agents in worsening social divides. And we dream up new justifications for the unconscionable. It seems that funding private schools is now an entitlement that we have as taxpayers, treating our tax contribution as some payment into a piggy bank that we can draw down on to suit our personal choices, whims and fancies. But it's worse than that. In a massive act of neglect, governments allowed private schools to serve who they like, where they like, and if they like. And you can't blame them. This is what they do. Wesley College is probably one of the closest schools from here. It boasts that it is an open entry school. To be considered, you have to wait for it, apply 2 years ago, provide a last school report, pay non-refundable fees, answer copious questions, agree to numerous conditions, all in some cases to be refused without reason. As an old Methodist, that whirring sound I can hear as John Wesley spinning in his grave. Trinity Grammar is another open entry school, so is Lauriston Girls' School. Lauriston Girls' School has managed to harvest the fourth most advantaged enrolment of all secondary schools in Australia. But in a classic Orwellian doublespeak, these schools ooze openness. The reality is that various forms of selectivity apply all the way down the private school food chain, all fuelled by public funding. Now, the result is hardly surprising and can be starkly illustrated. Private schools have increased their share of advantaged young people, but they enrol lower proportions of the disadvantaged. They are funded, incidentally, a portion of the cost of teaching all students, but they manage to avoid enrolling the full range. Nice, if you can get it. The battle to lift the poor belongs to public schools. In the mid-90s, there were 13 low-income for every 10 high-income students in public school playgrounds. Now the ratio is 16 to 10. It's a zero-sum game. Compounding advantage in some schools and compounding struggle in others. It has all the moral authority of a pyramid selling scheme, with those at the bottom not there because they were last in, but because of the families into which they were born. Worse than that, it's all justified with the language of openness, choice and democracy, and often clothed, sadly, in the creeds of Christianity. We might even excuse some of this if private rather than public ownership of schools delivered better outcomes for kids. And some people spend a large slice of their working lives trying to show that. But time and time again, the research shows that all other factors being equal, which incidentally they're not, the differences are actually very, very insignificant. But it's not all lost, because private school funding has reached such high farce and has wonderful entertainment value. Witness the unravelling, I don't know if you watched this, the unravelling of the current funding system. This system, according to its architect, David Kemp, would lower school fees and private schools could enrol everyone. Seemed like a good idea at the time, David. In the last decade of rising fees, the evidence has been screaming that it doesn't. But that's all the politics of envy, responded John Howard, and our opposition will recycle that one. You'll get that one in droves tonight. But everyone is now having second thoughts. Private school peak groups seem to be walking away from the funding system. It even seems apparently that John, politics of envy Howard, actually had misgivings which he passed to no other than Brendan Nelson. Brendan said it was all David's doing. We know that David can't blame Amanda. They're falling over each other to come out. It reminds me of the politician's creed. We hope and pray it will be a success, but if it isn't, we knew all along and said so. Nice one. And perhaps the third speaker of the opposition tonight knew all along and said so. We might find out tonight. And who knows, if this collective contrition gathers pace, private schools might hand back their over-entitlement payments. Christopher Pyne might have a road to Damascus experience. Shane Maloney might be welcomed back with open arms to Scotch College, with squadrons of pigs flying in perfect formation overhead. But look, let me close with a challenge to our opposition tonight. I grew up in a town not far over the border where shopkeepers and solicitors and Indigenous and Anglicans, we all supported the local school. It was the stuff of egalitarianism, community and achievement. Tell me that this is wrong. Tell me with evidence that there is a bonus for kids and communities in dividing them up in their schooling. Tell me the advantage. Tell me the story again, the advantage of having the rich with the rich, Catholics with Catholics and Anglo with other Anglo. Tell me again how pooling the advantage together and piling up obstacles in front of those less able creates a better society, a progressive democracy and a prosperous economy. Tell me that in the face of all this, it's conscionable for governments to make things worse, because our funding of private schools is unconscionable in every possible way.
Good evening, and thank you very much to the Wheeler Centre and to Simon for the opportunity of being here tonight. Before beginning outlining some reasons why I believe non-government schools must be funded, I'd like to do a bit of a quiz. Some of you who follow politics might have an advantage here. Who are the following prominent politicians? And they've all spoken about funding and school choice. Number one, if parents are unhappy with their local school, they should, quote, vote with their feet and move their children to another school. Number two, and I want to reiterate here the government's support for the full right of parents to choose the school that best meets the needs of their child. Number three, in relation to school funding, this is not about taking money away from schools. No school will lose $1 of funding in the sense that their school budget per student will not reduce in real terms or dollar terms. And the final quote. There is no school's hit list for those who want to run a scare campaign, and no school will be worse off, not $1 taken away. Now, it actually wasn't John Howard or Brendan Nelson or the current shadow Education Minister Chris Pyne. It was in fact Kevin Rudd, who some of you might remember was Prime Minister, Julia Gillard, still Prime Minister, but I'm watching the time, and Simon Crean. So the ALP, in fact, and it's not just the Liberal side of politics that argues for school choice and for funding, the ALP federal government is committed in terms of rhetoric, because actually I don't believe them, but that's another debate. The ALP government is committed in rhetoric to school choice and funding. Only the Greens party at the federal level is in favour of cutting funding. It's understandable why the ALP government is so concerned about funding as an issue. Australian parents, as you might know, are flocking to non-government schools, especially so-called aspirational voters in marginal seats. And we only need to remember what happened to Mark Latham's hit list of schools in that election some time ago that was caused their defeat. After Kevin Rudd took over, after Julia Gillard took over the ALP, they no longer talk about that hit list. Why? Because approximately 34% of students attend Catholic and independent schools. At years 11 and 12, the figure goes up to over 40%. Some of you may have read recently in the ACT that, in fact, for the first time ever, the number of students attending secondary schools are in the non-government system, not the government system. So the reality is that parents are voting with their feet. Over the 10-year period, 98 to 2008, government schools only grew by about 1% enrolments. Non-government school enrolments grew by 22%, which is a significant difference. Non-government schools also, even after adjusting for socio-economic profile, achieve better results than government schools, or most government schools. And the surveys suggest that the reason why non-government parents are choosing those schools is because they would suggest that those schools achieve better results, have a better disciplined environment, and a school culture that better reflects their aspirations and values. Instead of asking why non-government schools are so popular, critics argue that funding should be cut. The Australian Education Union, for example, argues that there is no pre-existing, predetermined entitlement to public funding. Obviously, we totally disagree with that. There are a number of arguments in favour of funding, and I'll go through them quickly. One is that there are international agreements and covenants guaranteeing school choice. The UNESCO Convention Against Discrimination in Education is one. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights is another. The UNESCO Convention states that parents must have freedom to choose for their children's schools that are not part of the state system. Parents must also be able to choose schools that ensure a religious and moral education in conformity to their own convictions. In a liberal democratic society such as Australia, I would suggest freedom of religion, if it is to have any meaning, must mean that parents have that choice. The second argument, state and federal governments, via COAG, Melbourne Declaration, a number of partnership agreements, are committed to raising standards across all Australian schools, and they argue that we must lift our performance. The reality is that non-government schools are very effective in achieving those outcomes, whether it's NAPE Plan, which is the Victorian National Assessment, Literacy and Numeracy, Year 12 assessment, retention rates, tertiary entry. The reality is that non-government schools, for a number of reasons, do achieve very strongly. Gary Marks at the ACER argues that it's not just because those schools are somehow exclusive or that they pick and choose who they enrol. Gary argues, and I'll quote from him, differences in student performance between and within schools cannot be accounted for by socio-economic background. Socio-economic background does not substantially account for the relationship between educational differentiation and student achievement. Obviously, critics argue that the only reason non-government schools do well is because they have privileged communities, privileged students. A lot of the research here and overseas is suggesting it's not as simple as that. The reality is that students often do well because they're motivated, because they work hard, because they've achieved a solid foundation in the early years. So it's not just socio-economic background. Another argument in favour of school choice is that most of the international research identifying stronger performing education systems suggests that such systems are characterised by autonomy, competition, diversity and choice. Now, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to understand that most of those characteristics are associated with non-government schools, with Catholic and independent schools. I've taught in government and non-government. I taught out at Merrylands in Reservoir, Thomastown, St Helena, another government school, and then Camberwell Grammar. So I've had experience over 18 years of both systems. And the reality is, and I know it's changing ever so slightly, is that government schools are centrally controlled. They don't have the same autonomy or flexibility that non-government schools have. The best example would be the Building the Education Revolution program, where you might remember that Catholic and independent schools were able to deliver that program far more effectively, far more cheaply, and far more in tune with what they actually needed compared to government schools that really had to take off what they had to follow what they were told from head office. Another argument in favour of school choice is that while much of the Rudd-Gillard education revolution is very centralised and bureaucratic. There is increasing agreement, as I've mentioned, that autonomy, diversity and choice is the way to go in terms of stronger educational outcomes. Professor Brian Caldwell from Melbourne University has worked in this area in a significant way over many years, and recently he did a report for the government that Julia Gillard launched a year ago. And Brian Caldwell makes the point that Australian schools, especially non-government schools, suffer from a command and control form of management, and that autonomy and flexibility at the local level are preferable. What is known in the Catholic system as subsidiarity. If you look internationally, the growth of charter schools in the United States also shows that there is a movement increasingly to autonomy, diversity and choice. James Tooley, the English academic, talks a lot about India and South America in terms of lesser developed countries following that model. And the British government has recently decided that it will, and if you've read the white paper, many of you probably haven't, but it says in the white paper that it will go down the road that Sweden has done. Non-government schools also strengthen social capital and social cohesion. So I disagree totally when the argument is put that they fragment society. James Coleman in the US has looked at faith-based schools. They're very effective in strengthening and reinforcing social capital. The Foundation for Young Australians last year released a report about Catholic schools in Victoria that students there are less likely to experience racism. I don't always agree with the Prime Minister, Julia Gillard, but I believe she is correct when she argues that the non-government school critics are wrong. Gillard argues, can I say to the Australian Education Union and to everybody else, we have left the debates of public versus private behind us. They are yesterday's debates. We want to make sure every school, whether it's a state school, an independent school or a Catholic school, is able to offer a great education. Regardless of school attended, Australian parents, students and schools deserve no less. Thank you.
Beatrice Duong.
Ladies and gentlemen, regardless of whether you're rich or poor, whether you come from a family worth millions of dollars or a socio-economically disadvantaged background where your parents hold little value to education, whether you live in the city or whether you go to a rural school in the middle of nowhere, every single child deserves an equal, good education in a properly facilitated school. So I have two main ideas to look at tonight. Firstly, when it comes to how much money is actually available, private schools are massively advantaged in comparison to public schools because of their ability to accumulate funds through different sources of revenue. And the second kind of idea is that the current system in Australian culture means that a hierarchy exists and is being exacerbated between the students of public and private schools. So let's look at this first idea. Where do private sectors and private schools get their revenue? Apart from state funding, they get it from federal and Commonwealth funding, state government grants, private and school fees, donations from the church, past members, sponsors, from investments, and even in some cases from interest-free government loans. Let's consider the system in which Commonwealth funding is distributed to non-government schools. So there's two types. You've got the average government school's recurrent costs. This determines how much money is spent on government schools per state annually, and then uses this figure to derive how much is given to the private sector. Then there's the socio-economic status, or SES. Basically here, private schools get a score and then an additional amount of money. The lower their SES, the more money they're supposed to be allocated, and vice versa. So what are the problems with this system, you may ask? Well, the opposition have said it themselves. Firstly, it doesn't take into account any of the other sources of revenue I've just listed before. And secondly, with the SES protocol, there is a deal where schools previously listed as funding guaranteed or funding maintained can only remain static or gain, but never lose their funding, meaning that the amount is fixed and doesn't change in relation to the SES score. Basically, no school will lose $1 of funding. They therefore don't get the smaller amount of money that they would normally be given under this system. So what I want to ask you today is, why are all our governments undermining their own policies? And why is this such a bad thing? Well, recent research has shown that the general enrolments, i.e. the more inexpensive to teach students in government schools, has been decreasing, while equity enrolments, i.e. the number of more costly students, such as those from low socioeconomic backgrounds or with special needs and disabilities, has been increasing through residualisation. After all, public schools cannot pick their students, while private schools can. This has resulted in the overall cost of running public schools increasing, and since this value is used to determine how much money is given to private schools, it means that private schools end up getting more money proportionally because it costs more money to run the public sector. Yeah, it doesn't make sense to me either. This value is extraordinarily disproportionate to their sector's needs. Every extra unnecessary dollar given to private schools not in desperate need is another dollar not spent on improving the government schooling system. It's unconscionable to see private schools, with all the money that's available to them, buying a new oval or constructing a pretty little hall, when the public schools right down the street from them are falling apart and scraping everything they have together just to buy some new books or furniture. The opposition have talked today a lot about choice. Well, exactly. Shouldn't everyone be able to choose to go to their local public school without having to accept reduced quality, without being subject to discrimination from their own government? Shouldn't they be given the choice to go to a school with decent facilities without having to commute halfway across the city? Isn't it the government's responsibility to take responsibility and to provide equal opportunities for the majority of its population? Without equality in all institutions, school choice becomes nothing more than a tokenistic notion. There's no denying the facts. Private schools are simply richer. Research demonstrates that, extraneous variables aside, the single prevailing factor associated with student academic success and self-efficacy is teacher quality. Now consider this. What happens when teacher shortages gets even worse? Will it be the private or the public schools who are better able to cherry-pick the highest quality people? So continuing from this idea of choice, let's look at my second key point now. Thanks to the discrepancies in funding and facilities available that I've just talked about, as well as the culture of elitism prominent throughout many private schools, there's a strong perception in the public eye that in order to achieve success in life, students must attend a private school. This mentality results in the creation of academic ghettos. I touched on it before with my idea of residualisation. What the government is really funding right now is this: exclusive private schools where students are selected and denied entrance based on their applications. Parent choice is the illusion of our innocent flower, but like a serpent beneath, the truth of the matter is that these private schools have all the control, the ability to pick and choose who they want to teach. Naturally, most of their students will be scooped from the top of the ladder. They'll be the most intellectually, socially, athletically, and economically endowed. This means that everyone else gets left behind. Government schools lose their leading students, and so the quality of learning possible is lowered drastically. The opposition is right about one thing. Performance in schools isn't just based on SES. It's based on the cherry-picking that happens in private schools. The tall will only get taller as they continue to shove The tall will only get taller as they continue to shove the low even lower. People are labelled and branded as better or lesser based on where they obtain their education. Is it not a sad comment on our Australian society that even now in the 21st century, the culture of elitism through socio-economic status and religious views continues to flourish? But really, let's think about it. Are private schools actually that great? Yeah, they often have better facilities, but I think that students deserve to be able to formulate their own ideas, opinions and attitudes, to develop political and religious ideologies without worrying about persecution from their school teachers and peers. This just doesn't happen in private schools. They're sent there for a purpose, to be conditioned to think and develop their opinions in a specific way. When you get sent to a Christian school, it's so that you can learn Christian ideologies. Although the government should not be actively stopping parents from doing this, it's also fundamentally wrong for it to be essentially helping to force its youth into these institutions to be indoctrinated. I am a proud public school student. I've turned down multiple opportunities to go to private schools because I wanted to experience the full emotional and mental growth that comes only with being exposed to the natural diversity of public schools. As a proud Australian student, I find it completely unconscionable that all my peers, both public and private, should be limited by this flawed and thoughtless system. Because when it comes down to it, that's what really matters, isn't it? The next generation and what we can do for them. Thank you.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm sure we'd all agree that school funding is an issue that incites an impressive amount of passion, with aggressive salvos of argument and insult flying to the media. We've seen a bit of that tonight. But what is it really? What happens when we cut away the hype, the stereotypes, the misleading statistics and the negative characterisations, when we get down to the core of the issue? In a wealthy democracy like Australia, it's a reasonable expectation that everyone should be able to receive a strong education and that the government will do everything they can to achieve this. That's it. That's the belief that I'm sure everyone in this room and both sides of tonight's debate holds. And I understand, I'm realistic enough to see that I've been sent up here as a private school student to argue for private schools. But that's not the whole picture. I'm not arguing for private schools, but schools in general. Because I know that strong government schools, like we have in Australia, are an essential part of our education system. It's just that cutting funding to independent schools won't improve them and could quite easily make them worse. If a problem exists in our education system, it isn't because of the existence of funding to independent schools, but an overall lack of funding. That's why, ladies and gentlemen, when we're dealing with the state of the education system as a whole, cutting funding to private schools is the unconscionable choice. I'd like to move on to my first point. And here, I'm going to be looking at the realities, the practicalities of what the affirmative side has talked about tonight. And now, if we agreed with their idea that funding to independent schools is indeed unconscionable, and then as a result, cut all this funding, what's going to actually happen? What will be the direct result, the first impact on schools in Victoria, in Australia? And to know this, we've got to look at funding. Now, the funding in Australian schools is kind of confused because it comes from two sources, both the federal government and the state government. As a result, you get a lot of the misleading statistics that I mentioned before, because if you want to, you can just report back on federal government funding and you get a whole different picture. What we need to look at is what happens in what happens when you combine the sums. And so when you look at it, in Victoria, the average independent student at an average independent school gets a bit over $5,000 per year from both governments. At a Catholic school, it's about $7,000, and at a government school, it's about $12,500. Now, what also happens to independent schools is, like Beatrice mentioned, an SES value gets calculated. What this means is that each school gets a value calculated based upon the socio-economic status of the children, of the parents of the children at school. And there are about 100, they vary from like 70 to 130 or something like that. What this does is changes the level of funding they receive. So yes, the average independent school receives $5,000, but you get other independent schools, wealthy independent schools, who only be receiving $2,000 or $3,000 a year from both governments combined, far less than the $12,500 that the average government school gets. And at the same time, there's the flip side of that coin. There will be independent schools who rely far more on government funding because they don't have the massive resources or the massive facilities that Beatrice painted the picture of earlier in her speech. Schools that rely on $7,000 or $8,000 of government funding. Now, it's important to see here that we don't characterise all independent schools as ridiculously wealthy, as amazingly well off. It needs to be understood that there are independent schools that cater to to niche markets to cater to different ideologies, to different values that are smaller, and rely on this government funding because they're not that wealthy. And now I'll quote Shane Maloney here, not because I entirely agree with what he's getting at, but because I think he summed up the idea with quite nice prose, that when he was at Scotch and described Scotch as a school, or schools like this in general, as machines for the transmission of inherited privilege. While this may or may not be true for some schools, and that really isn't the debate tonight, what we need to consider is all private schools, all independent schools, and how they'll all be affected by the opposition's model. Also, on the same line, there's also the characterisations of parents that go on. And now, not all parents are amazingly wealthy people who can just immediately afford all these school fees and the like. And now, it's been estimated by a bursar of a prominent independent school to me that 25% of the parents at his school struggled to pay the school fees. 25% of these parents decided that was the right decision. They used their choice to decide that is what their children deserved, and they did all they can to achieve that. No, it's important to understand that we can't paint all parents and we can't paint all independent schools with the same brush, because once we know what we deal with, we can understand what's going to happen if the opposition's proposal went through. What's going to happen is it's going to make it difficult for people to get educated in independent schools, because either the fees are going to go up at certain schools go up by so much that the parents can no longer afford them, or faced with that alternatives, schools will have to close. And it's not the only result for these children will be then to go to a government school system. And I'm going to make it clear now, this isn't a bad thing. I see it as an excellent thing for people to get educated in government school systems. But we need to understand, when 33% of children in Victoria are educated in the independent system, that's a lot of people that have to be dealt with. Even if just 5% of them moved across to the government school system, of course it could easily be far more than that, but even if only 5% moved off, and that is a lot of people that need to be taken care of. And we've got to question whether the government school system at the moment has the mobility, has the resources to build new campuses, hire new staff, and deal with the sudden influx. And deal with the sudden influx of new people that would come under the affirmative sides model. So we need to look at the realities and the practicalities of whether this can actually happen. What we also need to look at is it costs the Australian government a lot more to educate someone under the government school system, $12,500 as opposed to $5,000 on averages. And now, I'm not going to portray the parents of independent school students as social angels or anything of the kind, but they are actually saving the government a lot of money by sending their kids to independent schools. They're subsidising the government's expenses and doing a lot of good. If a lot of these independent schools had to close down, or these parents could no longer afford to send their children to these independent schools, then the government would have to spend a whole lot more money. And like it was mentioned by the affirmative side before, this is a zero-sum game. Money's going to have to come from somewhere, and somewhere else spending is going to have to be cut. That isn't what we want in Australia. We don't want to be, shortchanging different other things when we've got a perfectly good system at the moment that is working quite well. I'll move on to my second point. The idea that under the affirmative sides model, we'll be actually increasing the division between schools and further contributing to the stratification of our school system. And now, Chris Bonnor came out here with his first speech and put out the noteworthy and very worthwhile aim of increasing the equality in the school system, make sure everyone gets a fair go. But the problem with this is there's a bit of a problem-solution gap. He came out here with a problem that the school system at the moment isn't equal, but the solution to cut funding to independent schools isn't necessarily going to solve that. He never explained why that's necessarily going to lead to an equal ballgame. Because what we need to consider here, and this is why it won't lead to an equal field for everyone, is that with the SE to S values and the different levels of funding that independent schools get, the schools that are going to be most disadvantaged by the affirmative side's proposal to cut off funding are the ones that rely most heavily. And the schools that get $7,000 or $8,000 of funding from the government every year are the ones whose the parents of their children are from the lowest socioeconomic classes. That's a simple fact. They're the people who could least afford to deal with a $7,000 or $8,000 pricing place. At the same time, again, there's a flip side to the coin, and this is why characterisations just don't work in a debate this diverse. The schools that are going to be the least affected by the affirmative side are the ones that only get $2,000 or $3,000 a year. The schools, the most exclusive, the most wealthy schools, and the most of the time, the schools that are meant to be that the affirmative side is characterising as bad. The problem they want to stop isn't going to be affected. The problem they want to solve isn't going to be affected by their model. But how this is actually going to create a more diverse system is because parents who, with independent schools, the mid-tier independent schools who rely on government funding, if the parents can no longer afford to get to send their children to those schools, then it's no longer going to be viable for that school to stay closed. I've already talked about what's going to happen to the government school system if these children moved across. We also need to consider how it's going to develop into a stratified system where there's the exclusive schools whose prices have gone up with an increased demand for them, and at the same time they're getting pushed further out of reach for most people. And then the only other alternative is government schools. Now, that's not a bad thing. It's just that the problem the affirmative side is trying to solve isn't being solved because it's not a realistic idea. So, ladies and gentlemen, when it comes down to it, the way to improve our education system isn't to slash funding to independent schools. This would create more problems and more difficulties in an industry that doesn't need them, leaving us with a system that is worse off. We need to maintain strong schools for everyone and understand problems won't be solved by cutting funding to some schools. And in fact, cutting funding to independent schools is the unconscionable choice. Thank you.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We have here tonight for your delectation two very well matched teams to debate this hot and contentious issue. We have two persons in Chris and Amanda, persons of expertise and experience in the field. We have two very fine young people who are, I'm sure you'll agree, a tribute to their parents and an ornament to their schools. Who in fact experience this issue directly day to day. And we have two creators of lurid fiction designed to both frighten and provoke laughter, each with a taste for the histrionic and a very different view of what constitutes the conscionable. So Kevin's had his go, now it's mine. Now, as for you, the audience, I'm not going to insult your intelligence by suggesting that anyone has come here tonight with an open mind, prepared to be swayed by the most cogent argument. You're here for a bit of ideological biff. This is a Melbourne audience. You don't go to the match and not know who you're barracking for. So, on with it. Our topic tonight is money. Those who have the money, those who get it, who should and who shouldn't, and why. I've got 8 minutes and I'm going to use them to give you every reason I can think of in my allotted time. This is not a highly constructed, tautly constructed argument as to why public funding of commercial, exclusionary, segregated and cult schools is a bad idea. This is a spray. Out with the Uzi. 1. As currently operating, the federal government does not pick and choose which private schools it supports. In the name of equity, it can't. It's one in. All private schools, no matter how segregationist and exclusionary, no matter what their underlying motives or philosophy or belief systems are eligible for public monies. Now, nobody wants their kids sitting next to a disruptive dickhead. But what if you don't want your kids sitting next to a dirty coon or a kike or a godless infidel or an 8-year-old Muslim terrorist? Good on you, says the government. Knock yourself out. Set your own school up and we will automatically fund it. We don't discriminate, even if you do. So the exclusive brethren, and I think the name's a bit of a giveaway here, says ours, and I'm quoting from their website, ours is a school for members of our own sect. And the government says, no whackers, where do I send the cheque? What if you just want to milk suckers? Well, then you set up the Yarralinda School in Mooralbark under licence from Applied Scholastics International, a division of the Church of Scientology. You enrol 26 children of your followers, and L. Ron Hubbard's your uncle. The federal government gives you $120,000, which just about covers your franchise fee. Banned in Europe, we give it our children's school lunch money. What if you want to exploit the vulnerable, like the little pebble of St Charbel in New South Wales? Government will give you $300,000. Or what if you want to tell an Indian heritage child not to use brown or black crayons because these are impure colours, like the Anthroposophic Steiner School in Footscray said? Well, what if you want to promote effortless learning for primary schools through transcendental meditation, TM? Trademark. If you're the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi School in Reservoir, go figure, you get $15,565 per student in funding and capital works. Well, down the road at Reservoir Primary School, the students get a measly $9,800. This is all on the My School website. I recommend it to you. It's a real education. Next, public funding of private schools promotes the abandonment of public education, a central pillar of democracy and civil society, by the middle class. In other similar societies, Canada, in Europe, in the US, the skills and energies of the middle class are engaged in a positive way with society through the shared experience of parenthood, education and a common investment in the future of all our children. Here, the public funding of private school rewards middle class flight from a key community institution. It rewards people for walking away and thereby contributes to further fragmentation and ghettoisation. Parents who are active contributors, I think plenty of us have seen this at their local primary school, suddenly nowhere to be found, lose interest. Instead of citizens, suddenly they're just customers. Next, it distorts the whole educational sector by narrowing the purpose of secondary education to a high TER score. Now, that essentially is what private schools are selling, that your child will have a comparative advantage in the tertiary admissions contest. Now, good scores are important, and people naturally want them for their kids. I want them for my kids, fine. They got them. At a government school. But that is essentially what is driving the growth of private schools, right? We've heard stories here about underperforming students in Year 11 being turfed. The private school then can offer scholarships in that place, recruit high-performing government school students and use the increased average as a selling point. That's just legal crookery. Next, the problem with this system is that it exposes the hypocrisy and mendacity of the political class. Now, this is not a good thing. It undermines democracy. If people find that we have a free market liberal turning out to be a closet socialist, someone who believes in the cut and thrust of the marketplace, is actually subsidising key sectors of the industry that happen to fit in with their particular plan. So they undermine their ideology, they appear hypocritical. Labor does the same. We've been provided with lots of examples tonight of Labor hypocrisy. I think that I'll just add my own. Kevin Rudd calls the exclusive brethren a vicious cult that breaks up families. He then gives them $1.5 million. To maintain the illusion of democracy, people should be shielded from this crap, not exposed to it. Next, it undermines mainstream religion and brings it into disrepute. It's great for the wacky cults and the old establishment crowd at St Winklevoss Brothers Academy, but it fatally confuses the sacred and the profane. No genuine religious faith can be based on state subsidies. Faith of our fathers living still in spite of fire, dungeon and sword. What happens? The Vinnies at St Vincent's Hospital heal the sick. The Vinnies at St Vincent de Paul look after the poor. The Vinnies at the Catholic Education Office take politicians for a ride and explain that the funds had better be forthcoming. Nice public education system you've got there. Pity if anything should happen to it. This does nothing at all to enhance people's belief in religion. The faster the subsidies grow, the faster the real belief declines. The Pope is worried about Christianity fading in Australia. Next, it entrenches... Was that the bell? No. Wow, great. Next, I think we're up to about 6 or 7. It entrenches Aboriginal disadvantage. According to the Sydney Morning Herald, white parents are moving their children out of government schools in rural New South Wales and into church and commercial schools so they don't have to share their classrooms with Aborigines. Private and church schools have become the accomplices in funded segregation. And what would Martin Luther King make of that? I mean, that's just not just unconscionable, it's wicked. Finally, and most importantly of all, I think public funding of private choice rests on the assumption that we are a country which is not capable of operating and cannot afford to create an equitable and successful education system open to all students, subject to proper scrutiny and free to all families. Other countries have no trouble at all doing it, but we, for some reason, are told that we can't. Now, to accept that this current setup is the best solution or even indeed that it is any solution at all, is to sell our children short, to deny them, all of them, the opportunity to thrive and succeed. It does not widen their world, it narrows it. And that's the most unconscionable thing of all.
Thanks very much to the Wheeler Institute for putting this on. A good debate's always a good thing. Thanks to the opposition for some entertainment. But I haven't come to be funny. I'm sorry. I can be funny, but not tonight. My first proposition is education isn't welfare. That's the fundamental proposition. It's the entitlement of every Australian child to a good education. The government requires it, and the government has an obligation. It isn't welfare. It's not something where you say you can afford to do it yourself, so we're means testing you out. Every child is entitled to some form of contribution from the Australian government. I agree entirely. Government schools should be the best they can be. Any kid who goes to a government school should come out with every opportunity that they can and be the best they can be that they want to be. I agree with that. That's not what we're debating tonight. We're debating at the same time, should you say I'm not going to fund private schools, not give them anything? Well, I think that's a mistake. You've been told by the opposition that the taxpayer has the privilege of funding private schools. It does depend how you say it, doesn't it? The taxpayer has the privilege of funding the education of every Australian child. It happens that they give less to the kids who go to private schools than those who go to public schools, and I don't complain about that. But to argue that you should give nothing, to me, is absolutely abhorrent. I think it's a ridiculous argument. Primarily and solely, in one sense, I could rest on this, that it isn't welfare. But there's more to it than that. I think it's a silly idea because it would cost, in a forward estimates period, billions of dollars. You know, we're not talking about the trick-or-treat end of the budget here. We're talking about billions of dollars if you want to make this sort of change. If you want to say to people who either are rich or both parents work and they scrimp and save to make this choice, we're not going to give you any money, then you're going to have to fund them, and it's going to cost you billions and billions of dollars. And I don't think we could afford it. But not only is it super costly, it deprives parents of a choice in where they send their kids. Now look, if I had kids, I wouldn't send them to some of these weirdo schools that you were talking about, with particular religions and cults. That wouldn't be my choice. But I don't think I've got the right to say to you that you shouldn't have that choice. The people who will know best and more about their family and their kids and what's best for them is the family. The governments that we elect, the public servants that help them, have tremendous skills, tremendous obligations and responsibilities and tremendous knowledge. But what is best for you and your child is not something they are a specialist at. You should have that choice as a parent. And I think you should accept that you get less if you make a choice not to go to a state school, but nonetheless you should have the choice. So, in depriving parents of a say, that is, they don't get a choice, it follows that there is no choice, and I think that's an extraordinarily bad thing. Now, let's come back to the point about the cost. Why don't... I've heard the claim from the left on make the rich pay. They used to say that. Why not let them pay? Let them pay if they want to. If they'll reduce the burden on the taxpayer and kick in themselves, and the taxpayer can kick in less, good thing. But if you withdraw the funding from private schools, you reduce the incentive for the wealthier families to spend their extra money on education. I think you should be encouraging them to spend the money on education. If you can draw them into doing it, good. It's a good thing. But what I'd like to hear from the opposition is, where is the money going to come from if you make this change? Now, I happen to know that extra billions, despite the fact that they do store a bit of fat in different departments, there's not billions sitting there, I can guarantee you, in waste. Not billions and billions. You can only find it in one of two ways. First, you can get increased revenue from taxes and the like. Well, that doesn't sound too bright, does it? because the average taxpayer is going to get slugged. The same taxpayer who was happy to kick in for their kids' education is now going to get slugged so that the government can provide it. It sounds odd to me. And the second way is to cut government programs. No one's ever happy with that. Believe me, I've had experience of it. Let them tell us which ones they're going to cut, so that we can have the privilege of paying for the education of wealthier families' children, paying full-toed odds rather than just paying the amount that we pay now. Now, look, it's a joke to say that all the kids who go to private schools are from wealthy families. And you hear the names of the really wealthy schools trotted out, and they might be really wealthy. But the huge explosion in small private schools is not because they were wealthy parents. Most of the kids going to private schools don't come from wealthy families. To pay for it, usually both parents work, and these are small local schools. And parents choose this because they want something different. Is that a bad thing? I don't think so. Maybe the kid's a pain in the neck and needs more discipline. Maybe they believe in particular religious influence that wouldn't be my choice. But it's not for the government or other people or public servants to tell you and me what your choice should be for your kids. No one will ever know as much about an individual and family's circumstances as they do. Knowing beyond the basic curricula what's best for your child is not a skill of the government. Does anyone really want to live in a place where unless you have the state-provided education you get no help? It's all too Eastern Bloc for me. I just think that it is important to understand that if you go ahead with this sort of policy, quite apart from it being morally reprehensible in the beginning, because you say, well, we're not interested in funding you because you're going to a different school, you will in fact increase the gap between the rich and the poor, because the really big schools that they're talking about, they'll stay. They'll have their endowments and everything else you've heard about, and the kids will still go there. It's the little schools that have sprung up with a chance to have a small private school. They're the ones that are shut. They're the ones where the parents won't be able to afford a small increase in fee. So you'll leave these totemic private schools in place. They'll keep going. And you will have had a Pyrrhic victory. I believe in choice. I think it's a good thing that if you want a school that provides a particular religious instruction, you should be able to get it, and you shouldn't have to give up government support for your kid in order to get it. I'm absolutely convinced of that. Now let me deal briefly with a couple of points. The point's been made that what these schools do is pool rich on rich and advantaged on advantaged. Well, I don't think that's true, as you know. Lots of kids that go to these schools go to small, little private schools. Did I read The Australian correctly today? Did I see, Beatrice, that you actually admitted that you thought a little bit of help for small private schools wasn't a bad thing? Or were you seriously misquoted? You see, everyone likes to hate the big rich schools, but this isn't about that. It's about all the private schools, including the little ones. And if you want to talk about disadvantage, go and speak to the Indigenous teacher in Cherbourg and ask him if he thinks that Indigenous kids can't be taught properly, or kids from low socioeconomic status can't be taught properly. Look at his example. It's a fantastic example of someone who demands from kids what they can give, raises their expectations of themselves, and it works. Cherry-picking best teachers might happen. Have to speak to the union movement to change that, so that government schools can really choose to reward the good teachers from the very beginning and not pay all teachers the same. I quite agree. Pay better teachers more. But you're going to have to sort out the union movement. It's not the problem of private schools. It's not their fault. It's a very controlled union movement. Some people here might brand people as better or lesser if they go to a private school. I don't. And don't include everybody else who supports private schools as doing so. In fact, when I was choosing staff for ministerial office, I freely admit this, I would put the applications into two piles: private school, public school. Go through the public school, take the best. And unless someone in the office could show me that there was someone from a private school who was better, much better, I'd take the public school. The vast majority of my office were kids from public schools. I don't think kids who go to private schools are better. Sometimes I think they're kids that just need a bit more help. And they're lucky enough to be in families that are able to afford it or can manage it, or there's a small local school nearby. So, I come back to my basic premise that I hope you agree with. Education isn't welfare. This is not about being rich or poor. It's about the Australian government funding every child. Yes, funding kids who go to private schools a bit less, but funding every child. That's the right and privilege of every Australian child, and you should not be looking at taking it away.